Gang stalking is about the furtherance of eugenics through an MK Ultra style program. The test subjects in California have the most credibility when it comes to where would you expect this to take place. So let me read from Wikipedia, and I'll try not to explore this too much, but there's some parts that demand exploration. Project MKUltra, sometimes referred to as the CIA's mind control program, was the code name given to an illegal program of experiments on human subjects designed and undertaken by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Experiments on humans were intended to identify and develop drugs and procedures to be used in interrogations and torture, in order to weaken the individual to enforce confessions through mind control. Organized through the Scientific Intelligence Division of the CIA, the project coordinated with the Special Operations Division of the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The program began in the early 1950s, was officially sanctioned in 1953, was reduced in scope in 1964, further curtailed in 1967, and officially halted in 1973. Of course, those of us who, are mess with the streets or who look into this, we know that it never stopped. The program engaged in many illegal activities. In particular, it used unwitting U.S. and Canadian citizens as its test subjects, which led to controversy regarding its legitimacy. MKUltra used numerous methodologies to manipulate people's mental states and alter brain functions, including the surreptitious administration of drugs, especially LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, as well as various forms of torture. Now, I have documented these things happening to me. I've documented the verbal and sexual abuse, the isolation, and various forms of torture, even though I haven't documented everything that they've done to me, And it's very consistent with this MK Ultra program, which would lead me to believe that this is a continuation of MK Ultra, which many other professionals and experts and physicians and PhDs and other people who have looked into this have come to the same conclusion as well. The scope of Project MKUltra was broad, with research undertaken at 80 institutions, including 44 colleges and universities, as well as hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. This is consistent with my gang stalking list. The CIA operated through these institutions using front organizations, although sometimes top officials at these institutions were aware of the CIA's involvement. As the U.S. Supreme Court later noted, MKUltra was concerned with the research and development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. The program consisted of some 149 sub-projects, with the agency contracted out to various universities, research foundations, and similar institutions. At least 80 institutions and 185 private researchers participated. Because the agency funded MKUltra indirectly, many of the participating individuals were unaware they were dealing with the agency. Project MKUltra was first brought to public attention in 1975 by the Church Committee of the U.S. Congress and a Gerald Ford Commission to investigate CIA activities within the United States. Investigative efforts were hampered by the fact that the CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed in 1973. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission's investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the relatively small number of documents that survived Helms' destruction order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to Project MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings later that same year. In July 2001, some surviving information regarding MKUltra was declassified. So as you can see, there were still the participants who were still alive, and some of them are still alive to this day. 20,000 documents are still around, so they had everything they needed to continue these experiments, and they already knew from the past how to get people to collaborate with them with a clandestine operation, in a clandestine operation. In 1945, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was established and given direct responsibility for Operation Paperclip. The program recruited former Nazi scientists, some of whom had been identified and prosecuted as war criminals during the Nuremberg trials. Several secret U.S. government projects grew out of Operation Paperclip. These included Project Chatter, it's 1947, Project Bluebird, 1950, which was renamed Project Artichoke in 1951. Their purpose was to study mind control, interrogation, behavior modification, and related topics. So these were precursor experiments. This has been going on for a very long time. It is absurd, the notion that they would just magically stop doing this when they have been doing this for almost 100 years. They have been doing this for 70 years if you want to start it in 1945. But I'm sure you all know it starts before then. It goes back to before 1890s. It goes back to before 1808 when psychiatry was coined. You know, mind control and behavior modification have been, you know, hot topics, controversial topics for hundreds of years. These terms, psychiatry, were just coined later on. Eugenics was coined later on. But people were always concerned with what to do with the poor, immigrants, criminals, and so on and so forth. And they were always looking for a quote-unquote scientific approach. MKUltra. The project's intentionally oblique CIA cryptonym is made up of the digraph MK, meaning the project was sponsored by the agency's technical services staff, followed by the word Ultra, which had previously been used to designate the most secret classification of World War II intelligence. Other related cryptonyms included Project MK Naomi and Project MK Delta. Headed by Sidney Gottlieb, the MKUltra project was started on the order of CIA Director Alan Welsh Dulles on April 13, 1953. Its aim was to develop mind-controlling drugs for use against the Soviet bloc, largely in response to alleged Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind control techniques on U.S. prisoners of war in Korea. The CIA wanted to use similar methods on their own captives. The CIA was also interested in being able to manipulate foreign leaders with such techniques, and would later invent several schemes to drug Fidel Castro. Experiments were often conducted without the subject's knowledge or consent. In some cases, academic researchers being funded through grants from CIA-front organizations were unaware that their work was being used for these purposes. In 1964, the project was renamed MK Search. The project attempted to produce a perfect truth drug for use in interrogating suspected Soviet spies during the Cold War, and generally to explore any other possibilities of mind control. Another MKUltra effort, Sub-Project 54, was the Navy's top-secret Perfect Concussion Program, which was supposed to use suboral frequency blasts to erase memory. However, the program was never carried out. Because most MKUltra records were deliberately destroyed in 1973 by order of the CIA Director Richard Helms, it has been difficult, if not impossible, for investigators to gain a complete understanding of the more than 150 individually funded research sub-projects sponsored by MKUltra and related CIA programs. The project began during a period of what Rupert Cornwell described as paranoia at the CIA, when America had lost its nuclear monopoly and fear of communism was at its height. James Jesus Angleton, head of CIA counterintelligence, believed that the organization had been penetrated by a mole at the highest levels. So notice they admit that it was actually the people in these institutions who were suffering from quote-unquote mental illness, paranoia, persecutory delusions, and things of this nature. Very interesting how the mentally ill are the ones experimenting on the people who are rather normal. Goals. The agency poured millions of dollars into studies examining methods of influencing and controlling the mind, and of enhancing their ability to extract information from resistant subjects during interrogation. Some historians have asserted that creating a Manchurian candidate subject through mind control techniques was a goal of MKUltra and related CIA projects. Okay, so let me just skip ahead here. This, oh, no, this is interesting anyway. Alfred McCoy has claimed that the CIA attempted to focus media attention on these sorts of ridiculous programs so the public would not look at the primary goal of the research, which was developing effective methods of torture and interrogation. I agree. Such authors cite as one example that the CIA's Kubark interrogation manual refers to studies at McGill University, and that most of the techniques recommended in Kubark are exactly those that researcher Donald Ewan Cameron used on his test subjects: sensory deprivation, drugs, isolation, etc. I've gone over all these things in the past. I decided to make an MKUltra video because it's very appropriate. One 1955 MKUltra document gives an indication of the size and range of the effort. This document refers to the study of an assortment of mind-altering substances described as follows. Substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. Very interesting. Now think about how this applies to my case. Substances which increases the efficiency of mentation and perception. Materials which will cause the victim to age faster / slower in maturity. Materials which will promote the intoxicating effect of alcohol. Materials which will produce the signs and symptoms of recognized diseases in a reversible way so that they may be used for malingering, etc. Materials which will cause temporary, permanent brain damage and loss of memory. Substances which will enhance the ability of individuals to withstand privation, torture, and coercion during interrogation and so-called brainwashing. Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Physical methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Substances which will produce physical disablement such as paralysis of the leg, acute anemia, etc. Substances which will produce a chemical that can cause blisters. Substances which will alter personality structure in such a way that the tendency of the recipient to become dependent upon another person is enhanced. A material which will cause mental confusion of such a type that the individual under its influence will find it difficult to maintain a fabrication under questioning. Substances which will lower the ambition and general working efficiency of men when administered in undetectable amounts. Substances which promote weakness or distortion of the eyesight or hearing faculties, preferably without permanent effects. A knockout pill which can surreptitiously be administered in drinks, food, cigarettes, as an aerosol, etc., which will be safe to use, provide a maximum of amnesia, and be suitable for use by agents, types, and on an ad hoc basis. Preferable for, raping people, which they have been caught doing on record. They've been caught raping targeted individuals, and they have went to the hospital, and they have shown signs of sexual abuse. A material which can be surreptitiously administered by the above routes, and which in very small amounts will make it impossible for a person to perform physical activity. Imagine how this affects martial arts. Now, this is part 1, and there is a lot to take in here. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you. Part 2 perhaps has even more to do with gang stalking than part 1. But they're all about gang stalking, and eugenicists are behind all of this ultimately. CIA documents suggest that chemical, biological, and radiological means were investigated for the purpose of mind control as part of MKUltra. A secret memorandum granted the MKUltra director up to 6% of the CIA research budget in fiscal year 1953 without oversight or accounting. An estimated $10 million, roughly $87.5 million adjusted for inflation, or more, was spent. It's a lot of money to just abandon, wouldn't you think? Especially when you have results, applicable results. LSD. Early CIA efforts focused on LSD, which later came to dominate many of MKUltra's programs. Technical services staff officials understood that LSD distorted a person's sense of reality, and they felt compelled to learn whether it could alter someone's basic loyalties. The CIA wanted to know if they could make Russian spies defect against their will, and whether the Russians could do the same to their own operatives. Once Project MKUltra officially got underway, in April 1953, experiments included administering LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes. People who could not fight back, as one agency officer put it. In one case, LSD was administered to a mental patient in Kentucky for 174 days. LSD was also administered to CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, other government agents, and members of the general public in order to study their reactions. LSD and other drugs were usually administered without the subject's knowledge or informed consent, a violation of the Nuremberg Code that the U.S. agreed to follow after World War II. The aim of this was to find drugs which would irresistibly bring out deep confessions or wipe a subject's mind clean and program him or her as a robot agent. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up several brothels in San Francisco, California, to obtain a selection of men who would be too embarrassed to talk about the events. The men were dosed with LSD. The brothels were equipped with one-way mirrors, and the sessions were filmed for later viewing and study. In other experiments where people were given LSD without their knowledge, they were interrogated under bright lights with doctors in the background taking notes. The subjects were told that their trips would be extended indefinitely if they refused to reveal their secrets. The people being interrogated this way were CIA employees, U.S. military personnel, and agents suspected of working for the other side in the Cold War. Long-term debilitation and several deaths resulted from this. Heroin addicts were bribed into taking LSD with offers of more heroin. The Office of Security used LSD in interrogations, but Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who directed MKUltra, had other ideas. He thought it could be used in covert operations, since its effects were temporary. He believed it could be given to high officials in this way affect the course of important meetings, speeches, etc. Since he realized there was a difference in testing the drug in a laboratory and using it in clandestine operations, he initiated a series of experiments where LSD was given to people in normal settings without warning. At first, everyone in technical services tried it. A typical experiment involved two people in a room where they observed each other for hours and took notes. As the experimentation progressed, a point was reached where outsiders were drugged with no explanation whatsoever, and surprise acid trips became something of an occupational hazard among CIA operatives. Adverse reactions often occurred. For example, an operative who had received the drug in his morning coffee became psychotic and ran across Washington, seeing a monster in every car that passed him. The experiments continued even after Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who had not taken LSD before, went into deep depression after a surprise trip and later fell from a 13th-story window. It is unclear whether he committed suicide or was murdered. Some subjects' participation was consensual, and in these cases they appeared to be singled out for even more extreme experiments. In one case, 7 volunteers in Kentucky were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. LSD was eventually dismissed by MKUltra researchers as too unpredictable in its results. They had given up the notion that LSD was the secret that was going to unlock the universe, but it still had a place in the cloak and dagger arsenal. However, by 1962, the CIA and the Army had developed a series of super hallucinogens, such as the highly touted BZ, which was thought to hold greater promise as a mind control weapon. This resulted in the withdrawal of support by many academics and private researchers, and LSD research became less of a priority altogether. Other drugs. Another technique investigated was connecting a barbiturate 4 into one arm and an amphetamine 4 into the other. The barbiturates were released into the person first, and as soon as the person began to fall asleep, the amphetamines were released. The person would then begin babbling incoherently, and it was sometimes possible to ask questions and get useful answers. Other experiments involved heroin, morphine, temazepam, used under code name MK Search, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, marijuana, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. Electronics. At least one sub-project of the MKUltra project was about the electronic control of human behavior, Sub-Project 119. Subproject 119 had the purpose to provide funds for a study to make a critical review of the literature and scientific developments related to the recording, analysis, and interpretation of bioelectrical signals from the human organism and activation of the human behavior by remote means. The survey encompassed 5 main areas: techniques of activation of the human organism by remote electronic means, bioelectric sensors, recording, analysis, and standardization of data. Hypnosis. Declassified MKUltra documents indicate hypnosis was studied in the early 1950s. Experimental goals included the creation of hypnotically induced anxieties, hypnotically increasing ability to learn and recall complex written matter, studying hypnosis and polygraph examinations, hypnotically increasing ability to observe and recall complex arrangements of physical objects, and studying relationship of personality to susceptibility to hypnosis. Experiments were conducted with drug-induced hypnosis and with anterograde and retrograde amnesia while under the influence of such drugs. Canadian experiments. The experiments were exported to Canada when the CIA recruited Scottish psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, creator of the psychic driving concept, which the CIA found particularly interesting. Cameron had been hoping to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He commuted from Albany, New York to Montreal every week to work at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University and was paid $69,000 from 1957 to 1964 to carry out MKUltra experiments there. These research funds were sent to Dr. Cameron by a CIA-front organization, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, and as shown in internal documents, Dr. Cameron did not know that the money originated from the CIA. In addition to LSD, Cameron also experimented with various paralytic drugs, as well as electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the normal power. His driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced coma for weeks at a time, while playing tape loops of noise or simple repetitive statements. His experiments were typically carried out on patients who had entered the institute for minor problems, such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, many of whom suffered permanently from his actions. His treatments resulted in victims' incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. His work was inspired and paralleled by British psychiatrist William Sargant at St. Thomas Hospital, London, and Belmont Hospital, Surrey, who was also involved in the intelligence services and who experimented extensively on his patients without their consent, causing similar long-term damage. It was during this era that Cameron became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, as well as president of the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. Cameron had also been a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal in 1946 through 1947. How sickly ironic is that? The same people who, knew damn well about who helped come up with the Nuremberg Code are the same people violating it. Unwittingly, perhaps not. Naomi Klein argues in her book, The Shock Doctrine, that Cameron's research and his contribution to the MKUltra project was actually not about mind control and brainwashing, but about designing a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources. In other words, torture. Alfred W. McCoy writes that that stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Donald O. Hebb's early breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method, which refers to first creating a state of disorientation in the subject, and then second, creating a situation of self-inflicted discomfort in which the disoriented subject can alleviate their pain by capitulating. Of course, we all hear about waterboarding and so on and so forth. To think that, this has nothing to do with waterboarding and things of this nature is absolutely preposterous. The applications and the use of the results of MK Ultra experiments never stopped. The same way they used the results of the Nazi experiments in Nazi Germany. The same way that they had mind control experiments is part of Project Paperclip on record. Remember, this is all Wikipedia. This is all fact. Okay, we look at the sources. There is a long list. I see 92 sources and further reading and external links. And you have the shock doctrine and the sources, Senate MK Ultra hearing Appendix C documents referring to sub-chop projects, New York Times, all these, this is very valid. This is very valid. I wouldn't say it's thorough. I'd say it's very informative, but I wouldn't say it's thorough, and I wouldn't say that it truly gets to the meat of it, but it does paint the picture very clearly, and it is very consistent with what is going on with thousands of Americans and Canadians and people all over the world who report covert experimentation on them, including technology, following, harassment, repetitive statements, which relates to the hypnosis and so on and so forth. Covert drugging, and so on. Okay, to think that MK Ultra halted and no similar experiments took place is rather insane. If you believe that, then you need serious therapy. You need to do serious research. You need to open your mind. You need to truly work on your deductive reasoning and critical thinking. And if you believe that I am not a victim with my over 3,300 videos calling out these people specifically and psychiatry specifically, when Cameron was the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association, you need serious, serious help. And if you are playing stupid, you need the most help of all, because you are a coward. The type of cowardice that should not be tolerated in a free and open society, in the institutions that are supposed to promote freedom, secure freedom, not secure oppression. Thank you.